Hi, my name is Dr. Jones. I'm your instructor for the summer Marine Science 210 section. And in addition to the normal slides that I'm going to talk about in class and YouTube videos, I thought I'd give a supplementary video going over some definitions and terms that I thought would be useful for you all. So hopefully this will be beneficial. If not, please let me know. So what I'm going to do is share my screen with you, my PowerPoint slide, and this is a page out of your textbook, and I'm going to have it subtitled, so feel free to read that as well. Okay, so like I mentioned before, this is the end of chapter 1 out of your textbook. And these are just some terms and concepts that I want you to know about. Now, I'm going to go over all of these terms here. So this might take me a little bit of time, but certainly the ones in yellow are very important. I want you to be familiar with those. So let's start. Here we go. Let's start with the first one, cartographer. A cartographer is anyone that makes maps. And we're going to talk a lot about maps in this class because that's how we understand where we are on the planet. So cartographer is anyone who makes or studies maps. The second term here, the Challenger expedition, is considered to be the first scientific exploration of the oceans. And we'll talk about this more in class, but that's the most important part. It's the first scientific expedition of the oceans. And it is still used a lot in marine science. And even though it was a long time ago, it's still very important. The next term is charts. Charts are, in this definition, are essentially maps of the ocean. So knowing where you are in the ocean, because if you've ever been out at sea on a boat, there's very little frame of reference. You don't know necessarily where you are. There's no landmarks because it's just blue water everywhere. So charts are very important. The fourth term here, Chinese navigators, also very important in terms of exploring the ocean. And one thing that Chinese navigators did, which was really, really important, one of the first major, I think, discoveries in ocean science, is use of a compass, a magnetic compass, to know which way is north. Because again, with charts, if you don't know where you are in the ocean, you don't have landmarks, you don't necessarily know which direction you're going, north, south, east, or west. So having a compass, you know where north is, you can understand where you are. Chronometer is essentially a fancy word for a clock, an old clock. If you think about a clock where the face has a minute hand and an hour hand, that's essentially what a chronometer is. And we'll talk about why this is important. In short, it's because to know where you are on the planet, you need to know something called latitude, which we'll talk more about in chapter 2. Latitude is kind of these lateral lines that we draw on the planet that go from the equator to the North Pole and the South Pole. The other part of this reference is longitude, and that goes from, in Greenwich, England, which again we'll talk about in chapter 2, around the Earth. Now longitude, you need a chronometer, an accurate calculation of time to know where you are. So again, chapter 2, but chronometer is essentially a clock, not a digital one, but like with a minute hand and an hour hand. The next one is Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus is complicated. He's a historical figure that is credited with discovering North America. For the context of this class, that's pretty much what you need to know. It's a lot more to that story for sure, but we'll we'll keep it to that definition for this class. Compass. Compass is a way that you can know which direction is north, right? And this comes back to what we were talking about before with the Chinese navigators. And if you have an iPhone, it sounds kind of funny to say, if you have an iPhone, it has a compass app in it. So if you're ever lost and you know how to read a compass and you have your iPhone, you can find your way home. So compasses are very handy, and they use the magnetic fields of the Earth. The next concept or term is James Cook. James Cook is also an explorer in similar ways to Christopher Columbus. Again, very complicated history and individual. But what James Cook is most well known for in terms of this class and this particular chapter is he was the first documented individual to explore the Pacific Ocean. Now, certainly we'll talk about this in class. There were a lot of indigenous populations in the Pacific and the South Pacific that were already exploring the oceans. But James Cook in, I think it was 1763, going off of memory here, I'm not sure, it might not be accurate, check me on that, did an expedition to Tahiti, which is a small island in the South Pacific. And the purpose of it was to watch a solar eclipse. And during the solar eclipse, a very rare event was going to happen, and it's called the transit of Venus. And Venus, the planet, it passes during the solar eclipse in front of the sun. So as the sun is being eclipsed, Venus is passing in front of it. What's important about this is you can calculate the time it takes for Venus to do this. This allowed people, physicists, etc., scientists, to calculate the size of the universe. We'll talk a lot more about this in class, but that was a very important piece of scientific history, not just for the ocean, but for all of science. The next term is echo sounder. Echo sounder is essentially a piece of equipment on a ship that emits a sound, typically like a radio frequency. You can't hear them when you do it. But what happens is the sound waves go down from the ship, they hit the bottom of the ocean, and they bounce back. And if you know how fast sound travels in water, which we do, you can figure out how long it takes for the sound to go from the ship to the bottom back up. And then you can figure out the depth of the ocean. So it's a really handy way to understand how deep the ocean is, right? Without taking a line and measuring it out, because the ocean is deep, like 4 kilometers, 4,000 meters. The average is very deep. So the next term is Eretta Stennis of Cyrene. This individual was, drawing a blank on the time, but the first individual to accurately estimate the size of the Earth. And the way they did it is using shadows in a well in Cyrene. And we'll talk more about that in class. But Eretta Stennis was a librarian who was very interested in information and was the first person to calculate accurately the circumference of the Earth, which is remarkable. And you can do it too. On a nice sunny day, you can go outside and, depending on where the sun is, you can figure out how big the Earth is. It's pretty cool. The next person here is Benjamin Franklin. Most people know Benjamin Franklin in U.S. history for various other things. But Benjamin Franklin in the aspect of marine science is important because he was the first person to really carefully think about what's called physical oceanography. And physical oceanography is essentially how waves and currents in the ocean move. And one of the big ones off of the east coast of the United States is called the Gulf Stream. There's a similar one off of Japan called the Kuroshio, and there's another one off of Australia called the East Australian Current. And we'll talk about each of these when we get to the physical part of this class. But Benjamin Franklin was the first person to really look at the Gulf Stream and say, this is valuable, and we should understand it, because if you're taking things from America and trying to move them to England to sell or vice versa, knowing where the currents are is really important, because it's kind of like, you know, if you drive, you can get on the interstate and drive really fast and get to where you want to go quickly. Or you can take little side roads and it takes a lot longer. You still get there, but it takes a lot longer. And that's kind of the idea of Benjamin Franklin and ocean currents, is knowing where the interstates are in the ocean so you can move things quickly. The next, term is called GPS, or Global Positioning System. This is essentially how your phone knows where you are all the time, right? So if you get lost, or you have Google Maps, or you know, Waze, or whatever you use to figure out where you are, if you get lost like me, that's GPS. And it's essentially satellites that orbit the Earth that carefully measure location. And that essentially replaced charts, right? So you can go anywhere in the world and have a pretty accurate idea of where you are if you have a good GPS. The next term is John Harrison. John Harrison, don't really need to know much about him, except he is the person that really developed the chronometer. He was the first person. And when John Harrison did this, it really opened the way for ocean exploration. That's all you need to know about him. All right, latitude, we talked about a little bit earlier, kind of going from the equator to the North Pole and the South Pole. Latitude is, you know, here in Colombia, where we are, we're about 33 degrees north of the equator, right? So, you know, you can go to any place in the world and it'll have a latitude, right? Now, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So that's different than longitude. Longitude is the lines that run from the North Pole to the South Pole. So again, latitude, longitude, right? And if you know latitude, that's great. But you need something else to know where you are exactly, right? Because 33 degrees north, I could be in South Carolina, or I could be in San Francisco, right? They have the same latitude. But there's a very big difference between longitude. So the longitude here in Colombia, not exactly sure. Actually, let me do this. Let me look on my app. Oh, great, now I'm not going to be able to find it. This is the problem of doing videos without preparation. All right. Apparently it's not on my phone. Anyway, so the longitude where we are is smaller than the one in San Francisco, right? So by knowing the latitude and longitude, you know exactly where you are, right? It's kind of like an XY coordinate if you want to think of it that way. All right, the term we skipped is Library of Alexandria. I mentioned earlier Stennis. Stennis was a librarian, right? So libraries are essentially sources of knowledge, right? We don't really use them necessarily a lot anymore because, you know, we have these things, right? And they access all the libraries and all the information online. But in pre-cell phone days, pre-technology, you had to go to a library to get information. And so the Library of Alexandria was the most famous one. And unfortunately, it was burned down. I forgot the exact year, but shortly thereafter, they went into the dark ages, and, you know, there was a loss of scientific information. No one knows how much information exactly was in the Library of Alexandria, but it was essentially, think about it as the Google of the time. So imagine if today just Google went away. All the information you look at on Google or the internet, imagine the internet is gone, like now, just poof, gone. That's essentially what happened with the Library of Alexandria, right? All that information was just gone, right? Burned. Talked about longitude. Ferdinand Magellan, don't necessarily want you to know a lot about him. Magellan was a lot like Columbus and Cook, an explorer. Magellan explored a lot of the Pacific Ocean, but he was an explorer. That's what that is. Mahon, we'll skip him. Not, I don't think that important. Matthew Maury is I think he was the captain. He was the person in charge of he was a naval officer. And so he was very interested in understanding physical oceanography, the currents we talked about that Benjamin Franklin did. Maury was really one of the important people early on in understand people wanting to study the ocean, right? He was important for that. The Meteor expedition, it was an oceanic expedition, a very specific one. I wouldn't worry about that one too much. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that's essentially the United States government arm. What do you call it? Government agency that studies the ocean, right? So when we talk about, sea surface, when we talk about temperature, like currents or like, animals that live in the ocean, a lot of it comes from research from NOAA. And there's a lot of marine scientists that work for NOAA. A lot of my friends work for NOAA, and they study all different parts of the ocean. We'll talk about that later. Oceanography, study of the ocean, all of it, right? It's not just animals, it's the water, it's the light, it's the gases, the chemistry, geology. The ocean is very complex. So oceanography is all of it. Oceanus, I'm not sure what they're referencing here. There's a lot of different meanings for this. I wouldn't stress about it. Don't worry about that term. Prince Henry the Navigator, again, another explorer. I don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time on these European explorers because, quite frankly, I think a lot of ocean exploration was done by Chinese navigators, which we touched on earlier. Also individuals from Australia, the South Pacific, South America, Hawaii. There's a lot of explorers that are kind of marginalized, for lack of better, or ignored, quite frankly. So these terms are mainly European explorers, and I want you to understand that it wasn't just European explorers exploring the ocean, even though they're the ones that show up in these textbooks all the time. So anyway, Prince Henry the Navigator, I think he was from Portugal. He was an explorer. Sea power, couple different meanings of this one. I think the way it's being used in this chapter is, and I think Britain did this a lot, is if you control the ocean, you control how things move. And we saw this recently last year, or this year. What year is it? 2021. We saw this when that big cargo ship, the Evergreen, got stuck in the Suez Canal. If you control the way ships move in the ocean, you have a lot of power. And Britain especially controlled a lot of the, if you look at England, it's a fairly small country, quite frankly, but they had a very good navy and they controlled a lot of the world's oceans, and they had a lot of power. Still do. The United States Exploring Expedition, don't worry about that one. Vikings, again, European explorers. These are kind of pre-Columbus, Cook. Vikings, quite frankly, from what I've read and learned, were probably the first Europeans to make it to North America, right? They were really good explorers. And, I know, again, like all these explorers, Vikings have a complicated history, but that's who they were. In voyaging, I'm not sure what they're referring to this. Voyaging is essentially just traveling in the ocean, right? You could also voyage on land if you want, right? Just get in your car and voyage to California if you want. Anyway, general term. All right, so that is all the terms from chapter 1, kind of my interpretation of them, kind of what I think is important. Again, in closing, I do think that the ones in yellow are very important. So please make sure to be familiar with those. So that's chapter 1. And if you got any questions, please let me know. I'll do this for every chapter, and it's useful for you all. We'll keep doing it. If not, then I'll stop. But I hope it is useful, especially the subtitles, etc. So if you got any comments or questions, please let me know. So thanks for your attention.